That was lovely. Thank you, Kathy. Never get tired of hearing the bells. Have you ever gone to the fridge to get that last piece of pizza, only to find that it's not there? Or gone to get your keys when you knew exactly where you set them down, and they're not there? And then you say to the people in your household, hey, what happened to that piece of pizza? Or has anybody seen my keys? And then you watch the person go to the refrigerator and pull out the piece of pizza and say, it's right here. Or they come over to where you're... I'm sorry, Kathy, this must happen in your house. Or they walk over to where you are and they say, your keys are right here. And then they say something not helpful, like, I guess you really weren't looking very hard. Or as my mother used to say to me, they're right here, JoAnn. If they were a snake, they'd have bit you. Does that happen because we're not really looking? Or is our mind in a different place and we're thinking about other things? We're preoccupied with problems and disappointments and fear of what might come next. So much so that we don't see what's right in front of us. Is that what's happening with our two travelers in our story this day? There was a lot going on those days 2,000 plus years ago when we come to our story. There was a lot going on, and those followers of Jesus had a lot on their minds. And we know what that's all about, right? Because just 2.5 weeks ago, we recalled and we observed all of those events leading up through Holy Week to the resurrection on Easter and the celebration of the empty tomb. And now, after all of that celebration of Easter morning, we find ourselves on Easter afternoon that same day, when we are introduced to a pair of travelers, Cleopas, along with another traveler who is never named, actually, but biblical scholars, much smarter than me, have told us that it is probably Mary, Cleopas' wife, who was actually present when Jesus died on the cross. So, as the disciples have locked themselves in an upper room, afraid that the Jewish authorities might come for them next, they are hiding. And as they are hiding, these two folks that we have just met are walking the 7 miles on the road to Emmaus. They're going home. They had been there for all of it. They had been there for the hosannas and the waving palm branches and the entrance into Jerusalem. They had been there in Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover as they followed Jesus of Nazareth, this remarkable young rabbi who had been making such an impact with his teaching and his preaching and his healing and giving people the hope that maybe this is the one, maybe this is the one, this God's anointed one that is going to lead the people and relieve us from all this Roman oppression. Yes, finally, this is the one. And then their hopes were crushed, or so they thought, because Jesus did not go to a throne, he went to a cross. And then there had been those moments of confusion Easter morning when the women had gone to the tomb and it was empty. And so they saw Jesus appear to them, and they started telling everyone, we went to the tomb and we saw Jesus. He is risen. We saw him. Of course, in that day, they weren't taken totally seriously. In that time, women weren't allowed to testify in public. Their words weren't really listened to or taken seriously. Nonsense, people said. Peter went to the tomb. He didn't see Jesus. He only saw a rolled up shroud in the corner, and what are you supposed to make of that? So Cleopas and his wife, discouraged and devastated, headed back to the suburbs, to Emmaus, where they lived and nothing really ever happened there. So they were going to go back there, and they were going to pick up their lives again and try to erase from their minds all that they had seen and heard, all of the terrible things. They wanted to erase them out of their minds, and they were so distraught as they walked along that they didn't notice this stranger who walked up alongside of them. All of a sudden, there he was, walking along and listening to them until joining in the conversation and saying, "What are you all talking about?" Now, we know who the stranger was, but Cleopas and his traveling companion didn't. And so you can imagine that they looked at him with shock. "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem? You haven't heard the news? You don't watch CNN or MSNBC? You don't know what's happened?" they said. "This Jesus whom we had put such hopes, you don't know what happened to him?" Now picture this. They maybe at this point had stopped on the road, and then they start walking again and blathering on about the events of the last few days, telling the person who was crucified about the crucifixion, and then this peculiar story about a resurrection or something. And there's Jesus walking along, listening patiently, we expect, until finally he had had enough. And he said to them, "Seriously? What is the matter with you people? How foolish are you? Do you not remember the words of the prophet, that the Messiah had to die and be raised to his glory?" And then he goes on to remind them about what all of the other prophets had said, starting with Moses and going up through the prophets. He is schooling them on what the prophets had said about himself. Now, one might think that at some point on this journey, Cleopas or his wife Mary would have gotten an inkling of who this was walking with them, teaching them on the scriptures. Were they blind? Some have suggested that they were just too depressed by what they had heard and seen. They were overwhelmed with their grief. And grief can do that. Grief can make you numb to what you see, or even render you unable to recognize what's right there in front of you. And maybe that was it. And maybe Jesus wasn't ready for them to know. So the story goes on to tell us that they finally arrive in Emmaus. The sun is setting, and Cleopas does what any Middle Eastern man might have done at that time, what we hope that each of us would do under the same circumstances, but offer the stranger hospitality. Invite him into their home is what they did. And Jesus seemed to hesitate for a moment, right? Perhaps he was wondering, are these people really ready to know who I am? But he finally accepts, and they sit down to supper with bread and wine, and then suddenly they realize who this is. So let's pause there with them for just a minute and think about every time that we receive the sacrament of Holy Communion Every time we celebrate at the Lord's table, we hear those words that Jesus said to the disciples on that night when he broke the bread, and he said, "This is my body, will be broken for you. And this is the cup of salvation poured out in my blood for the forgiveness of sins. And whenever you eat this bread and whenever you drink from the cup, remember me." So they gave thanks at the table, and Jesus broke the bread and began to give it to them, and their eyes were open, and they remembered, and they recognized him, and then he disappeared from their sight. Now we can imagine that might have been an awkward moment where they look at each other and went, "What just happened?" But then they start to say, "Remember when we were walking on the road with him and he was teaching us all this about the scriptures? Didn't we have a sense? Didn't we feel something inside of us stirring? Didn't we kind of know then?" And then they realize we have to tell the others. So they get up, and having just gone 7 miles from Jerusalem to Emmaus, they start on the trek back, and one would imagine running, because now they're full of energy. We have to tell everybody what we saw. And then they come upon the 11 and those who were with them, all assembled together, and they heard them saying, "It's true. What the women told us, it's true. The Lord has risen, and he appeared to Simon." And then the 2 travelers, perhaps a bit deflated because they didn't get to say their news first, probably said something like, "Well, that's great, and let us tell you what happened to us. He walked with us on the road to Emmaus. He walked with us, and he reminded us about all that the prophets had said about everything that was going to happen, exactly the way it happened." Of course, we didn't recognize him at the time until he came into our home and he broke bread with us, and then we knew. We knew and we saw that he had been with us, hiding in plain sight. And then there he was, with us, restoring our hope that we thought we had lost, restoring our hope, but in a new way. Okay. There was an author, Presbyterian minister, theologian, writer, all of the things, and he wrote about miracles. And he said, "Sacred moments, the moments of miracles, are often everyday moments, which, if we do not look with more than our eyes or listen with more than our ears, it reveals only a garden, or a stranger coming down the road behind us, or a meal like any other meal. But if we look with our hearts, if we listen with our being and imagination, we might see that Jesus is right there with us." Jesus appeared to those first 2 on the road to Emmaus to restore their hope. And we know that he also appeared to those 11 and the others in that upper room who were afraid, telling them, "Don't be afraid. Why are you afraid? I'm with you always. Even when things don't go as you want or hope, and that will happen, I'll be right there. I won't forget you." I have heard from folks over the years, "Why has God forgotten me?" Or, "Where is God in all of this?" Or, "Why doesn't God answer our prayers?" Have you ever thought that? Most of us have. And perhaps it feels that way because we are so caught up in our grief, in the troubles in our lives, in the fear of what might come next, whether it be a devastating illness or a loss of a job or a relationship ending. We are only focused on the pain and the difficulty of the fear and how we want it fixed. So focused that it clouds our ability to see or understand what is happening right around us. But as Frederick Buechner wrote, if we just look with our hearts and listen with our being, we're not forgotten. He is with us, giving us strength and hope to face whatever life puts in front of us. It's very tempting, isn't it, to give God directions. Here's my problem, and here's how I want you to fix it. Quickly, please. And then we wonder why God hasn't answered the prayer exactly as we asked. Annie Lamott, if any of you know her books, I commend them to you. She was writing about her own journey into faith, and she wrote, sometimes the only prayer that she could utter was, help me, help me, help me. And then be open to waiting for the help that would come in whatever shape or perhaps unexpected way, but it would come. That's the story of the journey to Emmaus. Jesus Christ journeys with us whether we know it or whether we acknowledge it or not. Now, we might have to reshape our imagination so we are not imagining what, with fear and stress, what bad things are coming next. Instead, imagine what blessing God is doing in our life at that very moment, even in the midst of our trouble and our pain. When we lean on and into God, we can see a garden as a miracle. We can see the face of Christ in everyone we meet. And we can see and feel God's presence when we break bread together. We can feel the presence of a living, loving God, providing peace and strength and hope. And if we are listening with our whole being, with our hearts and our reshaped imaginations, we might come to feel it and to know it and to understand it, just as the disciples did. That God's promise, I am with you always, it's true. Thanks be to God.